Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to use active imagination for shadow work. Alright, so last week I gave you guys a video about shadow work and really looking at it from the angle of the inverse relationship between the ego and the shadow. And basically about how judgment plays into that whole dynamic of creating an ego and the counterpoint of the shadow. And so it would be a good idea to look back at that video prior to watching this one, but there's no need to watch that one to watch this one, as I'm going to recap the major points. And then afterward I'm going to go into how to use active imagination, which is basically a Jungian process, and it's a method for communicating with the unconscious for the purpose of integration and shadow work. Alright, so regarding the relationship between ego and shadow. So the ego, to put it simply, is basically everything that we identify with ourselves, everything that's part of our identity. And the shadow is anything that stands in opposition or that could potentially threaten our identification with those things that are in our ego. So let's say that I think of myself as a good mother, and this is one of the core identities I have within my ego. Anything that I would consider to be bad mother-related things, I would have a tendency to want to ignore or repress in myself. So if I consider a good mother to be somebody who's selfless, and I have a very narrow definition of what selflessness is, I might have a tendency to ignore desires that are more focused toward myself or more toward my own individualism or autonomy. So the shadow is very much the inverse reflection of ego. And so it's kind of like they have a zeroing out kind of relationship between each other. So if we think about it in terms of a mathematical equation, if we have a positive one and we add a negative one to it, we end up with 0. And this is how the ego and the shadow work together. If we have a really strong identification in one direction, then the inverse reflection of that, or the shadow, is going to be equally strong in that direction. But if we don't have a really strong identification, it's going to be weaker, and it's going to be closer to that 0 mark to one another. And so the idea is that you want to, in dissolving the strong identifications with your ego aspects, it zeroes everything out and it creates a lot less internal noise, and more of your authentic self can come forward. Alright, so basically when we have an identification with the ego, it then becomes our job to protect that ego from being undermined, and so that we can keep that identification going. And the main thing that is dangerous to that ego identification is realizing that the shadow is also part of ourselves. And that's what has that neutralizing effect. And so what happens is that we try to create almost this barrier of protection around our ego identifications and anything that we relate to our self-concept. And the main way that we do this is through judgment. And so what that entails is that we end up judging ourselves internally if we express a certain trait or have a certain tendency, and we try to repress that away from our own awareness and keep ourselves from expressing it. And then we also start judging other people for having a trait that maybe seems similar or is the same as that trait. But what this judgment does is it enables us to insulate ourselves from awareness of our own shadow. And so judgment becomes a necessity for maintaining the illusion of ego and also maintaining unawareness of our own shadow. So there's a direct relationship between judgment and shadow. So the more judgmental a person is, the denser their shadow will be, and the less aware they will be of their own internal workings, the less integrated they will be. But the more open and accepting and loving a person is, the more they'll be able to integrate their shadow, which will also allow them to be more aware and more compassionate to other people as well. So practicing unconditional love and acceptance of ourselves and others is the #1 thing that we can do to bring us into a state of wholeness and integration and expanded awareness. And so much of being loving and accepting isn't an additive process of like trying to make ourselves be more loving or more accepting. What it is about a subtractive process of dropping judgments. But the question is, how do we actually let go of a judgment? So it basically doesn't work if we try to repress our judgments as well. Then that just becomes another judgment on top of ourselves, and we end up repressing that away as well. So that's not a good idea. But when it comes to like dropping our judgments, it comes to realizing that the thing that we're judging is actually a part of ourselves. So a judgment is basically when we say, try to put our blinders on and say, I am not that, and try to move as far away from that as possible and polarize ourselves away from whatever that thing is that we're judging. But if we can actually notice in real time that, oh, that actually is there, I can see it having an influence on me, then the judgments will drop away naturally. So one way that we can drop judgments and integrate our shadow is to be able to actually practice understanding and appreciating and validating the existence of those that we would typically judge. Because in being able to love and accept that person, it sends a signal to ourselves that we would be able to love and accept ourselves if we were displaying that same trait. So the shadow is created out of fear of ourselves invalidating ourselves, like we would go and invalidate other people. And this is why the judgment outward always becomes a judgment inward. And so it becomes too much of a high-stakes situation if we know that we hate and invalidate other people for having certain traits, because there's no chance in us even ever showing that to ourselves, because we're afraid of rejecting ourselves in the same way. And it sets up this whole scenario where you can't trust yourself. And so with regard to this concern of accepting others and accepting the self, this is why I'm proposing active imagination. So basically, active imagination is a Jungian process, and it's meant to allow you to engage directly with an aspect of the unconscious. So basically, the way that active imagination typically works is that you are, sitting there and you're waiting for an image to pop into your mind, and then you engage in some kind of scenario or dialogue with that image. Or you can actually remember an image from a dream, try to conjure it back up, and then you can actually engage in a scenario or dialogue with that image. So let's say if I dream about Captain America, and he's a character in my dream. Essentially, within the dream, he is an aspect of myself. And he is essentially a mask. Essentially, Captain America is the mask that that aspect of myself is wearing. And so if I engage with Captain America in the dream, I'm engaging directly with an aspect of myself. So if I go in and I want to do the process of active imagination by myself, later on, after I've woken up, I'll try to conjure back up the image of Captain America and try to engage that image in a dialogue or a scenario. And in listening to whatever answers or reactions Captain America gives me, it's hearing an aspect of myself through the medium of the image of Captain America. All right, and so with the way that I'm speaking of how to practice the active imagination, you're doing the same thing, only you're not doing it with a dream character. You're actually doing it with a person who's in your life. So if you have a person that maybe rubs you the wrong way, or that you just have this strong negative visceral reaction to them, what you'd want to do is you would want to conjure their image back up and then engage directly in a dialogue or a scenario with them when you're by yourself. So it's a lot like, if you're like having a shower conversation with yourself, and like let's say that you earlier on had some kind of conflict happen, and then you draw that that scenario back up, and then you're engaged in that conflict again, and maybe you're getting your parting shots, or there were some things that you wanted to say in the conversation that you didn't think of at the time. And so it's kind of almost a way of internally trying to resolve whatever that conflict is. So that's, in a sense, a form of active imagination, because this might be obvious to say, you're not actually talking to that other person. You're talking to yourself when you're saying that. So when you're engaging with that person, you're engaging with them as an aspect of yourself. So likewise, when you're engaged in the process of active imagination and you're talking to somebody that you know in life, it actually is, in a sense, that a mask for an aspect of your internal self that you're engaging with. So to understand this concept a little bit deeper, it's important to understand that we have aspects of ourselves that are conscious to us, And those are integrated, and those are in the forefront of our conscious awareness. And then within the unconscious, we have a lot of things going on. So we have archetypes down there. We can also, through this process, interact with archetypes as well, but that's a topic for a different video. But we also have parts of ourselves that are either unrealized, so we just haven't discovered them yet, or they're directly repressed away. So, and this is where the judgments come in. So things that we judge as bad or as something that would undermine our ego structure, they become these little fragmented parts of the selves. And those fragmented parts have their own wants and needs and general ways of being. And so this is why they can be symbolized through dream symbols or through another person that we might not have such a liking toward. So whenever, let's say, there's a person who is, let's say that we have a judgment against people who are, really showy with their emotions or and that kind of thing, because we maybe repress our own emotional our own self that's more emotionally sensitive. When we see an emotionally sensitive person, they instantly become a symbol for that repressed aspect of ourselves. And so when we engage in a shower conversation kind of dialogue with that person, what we're doing is we're engaging directly in dialogue with that part of ourselves. And so if our dialogue with them is combative, and it seeks to punish them, what happens is there's more of a split that occurs within ourselves. We're actually harming ourselves when we do that. But if we are able to get to a point of acceptance and understanding of that person, then that part of ourselves can actually come more toward the forefront of consciousness and become more integrated with the rest of ourselves. All right, so I'm going to give you the step-by-step process of how to do this. So intuitively, it is just engaging with those aspects of self, but here's some things to keep in mind. So the first thing I recommend doing is to be completely by yourself, because this is something that may include you sort of talking to yourself, and you don't want someone to walk in on that, and you don't want to feel self-conscious and like somebody is right there watching. So that's one thing. And the second thing is to set an intention of loving kindness. So you don't want to be micromanaging the experience as you go through it. You don't want to be trying to drive it in such a specific direction. But it's important to set your intention toward loving kindness, so it doesn't end up like one of those combative shower talks where you're trying to get in your parting shots at the person and you're trying to dominate them in a conversation. You want to get this experience to a point where you're able to practice love and compassion toward the image that you're engaging with. All right, the next thing to do is to actually start to engage with your image of that person that you are judging or that you dislike. Now, this can be in the scenario that you would typically engage with them in, or you can create a totally different scenario that you normally wouldn't be in. Some of my favorite scenarios to create are like, what if I was on a stranded island with this person and I had to cooperate with them to survive? Or what if I were trapped in an elevator with this person for hours and I had to converse with them and make peace with them? So those contained kind of situations can work really well for finding ways to accept that aspect of yourself through the image of that other person. All right, the third thing is to try to hit a flow state with the situation. Like, you don't want to be actively trying to conjure up a very specific image with your conscious mind to where you're like trying to account for all the details and really trying to pretend like it's a conversation. You want it to flow as easily as one of those shower conversations. All right, so once you hit that flow state, you want to make sure that you are expressing how you actually feel. So even though your intention is to be positive toward this person and to learn to love and appreciate the person that you're engaging with as a symbol of your unconscious, essentially you don't want to push it too much in that direction. You want to start off by expressing to them exactly how you feel about them. And if you're really upset with somebody or you really dislike somebody, you can straight up be like, I really feel like I hate you. And then take the conversation from there. And again, even though the intention is to bring yourself toward a state of integration and positivity with that aspect of self. You have to be very brutally honest with where you're at and how you feel. And so have that positive intention and set that positive intention early, but allow yourself to take twists and turns. And if you run into negative feelings, express those negative feelings and then see how the person reacts in the scenario. All right, so this brings me to my next point in this process, which is to seek to understand the person that you're engaging with and also to have them understand you. This understanding will help create that integration between the conscious aspect of yourself and whatever that unconscious aspect that you're engaging with. So let's say, for example, there is a judgment of people who are emotionally sensitive. So I'll bring up that example again. So you can say, look, if you're engaged with a person, who is emotionally sensitive and they're the symbol of that aspect of yourself that's being repressed, that is emotionally sensitive as well, then you could express to them, it's like, I feel like I dislike you because you just want a lot of attention, and that's the only reason why you're being emotionally sensitive. And then that part of yourself may answer back in a different way. It's like, well, I don't like to have myself suppressed and I'm just being authentic. And so you can get into these kind of argumentative dialogues, but that are really meant to sort of be a meeting of minds and to kind of understand where that other part is coming from. All right, and my last point on this process is to just let it go in unexpected directions. So the idea is that you let go of control in this situation and you kind of let the conversation run itself. So again, you're in that flow state and you want to follow the intuition. And sometimes that can bring you into positive areas and negative areas, and it can take sharp left turns into areas that you didn't expect it to go. And that's really where the magic of this process is, because it's a process of discovery. And if the conscious mind is in there trying to micromanage things and trying to make things go in a certain direction, then you're not going to get the full benefit of the process. So basically, as you go through this process, what you'll find is that it's easier to find points of appreciation about the other person that you're judging and also the aspect of yourself that they represent. So in doing that, you can bring those aspects of yourself that have been relegated to the unconscious and to the shadow, and you can bring them back up into the conscious awareness. And in doing so, what happens is these strong ego identifications and judgments, they let loose, and the parts of the shadow that have been repressed can kind of zero out with one another. And you find that it's a lot easier to be yourself without having to polarize your identity in ways that are unnatural. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and click the like button and subscribe. Also, leave me a comment down below. I love hearing from you guys. Share the video with a friend that you think might enjoy this content. Also, I wanted to say thank you guys so much to my patrons. It's really motivating to have you guys pledge to me, and I just really appreciate it. Also, I wanted to mention that I'm offering life coaching, dream work coaching, and tarot readings. If anybody's interested in those services, you can contact me at thediamondnetchannel@gmail.com. Basically, with those, it's a lot about self-discovery. So in those processes, if you're looking for clarity or if you just want to figure out what direction to go in life and want a strategic partner to help you set action steps to go toward those, then I highly recommend signing up. Dreamwork coaching is a lot the same way as the regular life coaching. The main difference is that we start off with the dream and we try to figure out what message it is from the unconscious that is trying to be conveyed, and then setting practical goals from there as to how to come more into alignment with what the dream is trying to convey. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.